Greetings and welcome back to Another Perspectives. We are here with our resident expert on Russia and all things Eastern Europe, Alexander Migtau. Now, the reason I'm having this discussion is because it's almost impossible to get a clear picture of Russia as a Western person. And I would argue if you're a Russian, you're probably also biased for obvious reasons. But a Western person who speaks the language, who is versed in the politics, who's visited, etc., but also knows the West, I think is in a much better position to offer balanced commentary and perhaps more accurate views on what's going on. So essentially what we're going to try to do, or what Alexander is going to try to do, is unravel, I guess, the mystery of Russia, because particularly in recent years, especially in light of the Trump election, it's been chaos and just very muddy. Nobody really knows what's going on. There's RTL, the Russian news channel, sometimes referred to as Russian propaganda news. And most recently, a good way of starting this off would be these laws supposedly concerning domestic violence. And there were articles in The Guardian and, the usual left-wing rags in particular decrying it. There were women in Poland even hoisting up signs in Russian showing their solidarity for the poor afflicted women in Russia. And I have to wonder, because we have statistics regarding domestic violence against men in Western countries like the United States, Canada, UK, and Australia, why domestic violence against Russian men would not be as common, if not more common, a phenomenon. Of course, we never hear about that. So thank you for joining me again, Alexander. I guess we'll just address this issue first, because that's the thing that's been in the news most recently. What's going on with this alleged decriminalization of domestic violence?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me again, Stardust.
Thank you.
What's going on in terms of domestic violence, decriminalization. Sounds very horrible. Everybody who reads these headlines now thinks, well, Russian men basically are now getting a green light from the Kremlin to abuse their girlfriends or wives. Of course, that is not the case. What has been scrapped was a law that, and maybe not just in Russia, but especially in Russia, has not really added any specific protection to actual domestic violence victims. So when we talk about domestic violence victims, we have to draw a line. What is a domestic violence victim? The Russians have decided to draw a line that the victim, or there is a victim when there is a damage inflicted upon it. So yelling at each other is unpleasant, but it's not domestic violence according as far as the Russians go. Squabbling over budgeting the household income, so how much money does the housewife get, which in some Western countries, when she doesn't get enough or doesn't get anything for not working, is considered domestic violence. The Russians have basically said we not want to go down this road, because at the end of the day, such legislation don't protect actual victims who get beaten or even stabbed or killed or whatever. They just basically distract the scarce resources of the courts and the police force to basically intervene in what you might term conflicted relationships and domestic squabble. So if maybe we can use a caricature to illustrate this. There's the usual, Arctic marriage in some Siberian industrial town with, lots of conflict and not a lot of money. And every Friday, they drink a bottle of vodka too much, and then they probably yell at each other or engage in what you might term soft violence, pushing each other.
What are you talking about? We're talking about Russia loving traditional marriage. You've got to be kidding me.
There is no traditional marriage in Russia alive. The reality is divorce rates in Russia are as high as they are in most Western countries.
They're actually higher based on my research. They're over 60. It's over 60%.
It depends how you look at the numbers, but something 50, 60% indeed is the same affliction that we see, the same transition essentially, where marriage and monogamy goes to die, and the same process in Russia. Now, what they have done is they have said, look, we're getting calls for, like, Ludmilla gets yelled at by her drunken husband. And now the police has to come in. And what is the police supposed to do? Okay, you have pushed her and she stumbled lightly. Now, imagine the police has to write a report, then that goes to the court, and then there is a judge who has to somehow now do something because there is a law. And how do you punish somebody for what is in effect, let's say, not really an offense? Yelling. That's what I mean. If that there's actual damage, like the Ivan beats Ludmilla up and she ends up in hospital or in intensive care even. Now that's a different story, and that is still a crime. But the idea that government and police force and courts have to intervene in all sorts of conflicts in our lives, the Russians have basically made the decision that they at that point don't want to further go down this road.
Yeah, and I don't know if this is an accurate observation, but in terms of political systems, it might be interesting to observe that, you went from a system during the Soviet Union where I guess political and government intervention existed on almost every level, to a system now, it seems, at least in this particular regard, where the Russians are just saying, well, maybe we don't need to intervene in every petty squabble that people have in their houses and homes. I mean, what's the point? Whereas we're in places like the United States, Germany, United Kingdom, it's gone completely overboard in that regard. It's almost as if the Russians are taking a more hands-off approach than the allegedly libertarian-leaning United States.
Indeed, and it's not just in the field of domestic violence or that. You can see it you can see it in the taxation, you can see that in all sorts of business regulations. Now, you can start a business in Russia, let's say in comparison to a place like Germany. Let's say you're opening a fast food joint. Now, in Germany, if you have tables, you need to have a toilet and this and that, and there are controls. And now, let's not argue whether that it makes all sense or not, but that certainly ups the price. It's basically creating a barrier, and that barrier actually affects those who don't have a lot of money to become self-employed. While in Russia, neither the society nor the state nor anybody has that resources to finance basically such a high market entrance barrier. And they're basically having a hands-on approach. There are lots of laws in Russia. I'm not saying Russia is like a lawless place, but very often these laws are very leniently enforced. In some places they aren't really enforced. Some places basically do their own thing. When you go to the North Caucasus, especially Dagestan and Chechnya, they basically have a de facto, let's say mild version of Sharia law even in place. And although this probably violates most, amendments in the Russian constitution, the locals are fine with it. The Russian government in Moscow basically doesn't really give a fuck as long as the locals are fine.
And as long as the Chechen locals aren't starting an uprising. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So if that's how the Chechens want to live, I mean, before the war, Grozny has been an ethnically multicultural city. Almost half of the population has been non-Chechen and even non-Muslim. And now after the war, it's 96% Chechen and Muslim. So it's now a very homogeneous society. And, basically the idea is if you don't like to live according to these standards, then you just don't go there. I mean, as I'm saying, I'm not trying to portray this as something positive or negative. I'm just trying to say it basically as it is.
It seems that Russia in general is... from my limited understanding of the place as a ignorant Westerner, just a lot more pragmatic about certain issues. That what I might say as a point of contrast is, in the West, I'd say throughout Western Europe, but very much in the case of the Americas, like Canada and the United States, as well as the United Kingdom, I guess the Anglosphere, there's a kind of crusader mentality, and by that I mean this perception of wrongs everywhere that need to be righted. Issues with, I don't know, different gender pronouns. I mean, that's extreme, but there's all manner of insanity that the Russians just can't seem to be bothered with. They just think, well, based on my observation, let's just get on with life. And I actually wish that mentality, I'm not saying I wish I lived in Russia or were Russian, but I wish that sort of mentality was much more common in Western countries rather than the crusader mentality of, we need to just fix every problem. If for example, if I move to a place that I know is filled with lots of Muslims, very religious Muslims, I mean, I know what I'm getting myself into, so I'm not going to move there, obviously.
Yeah.
Just things like that. It just seems a much more practical attitude. I wonder if a lot of the perception or the way it's a portrayal, rather, of Russia is to some degree propagandist in that sense, that it's just that Russians are just being pragmatic, but particularly in the West, there's a way of it being sort of twisted and turned into something it's not. Maybe you can offer some commentary on that.
I mean, yes, there are some places where the Russians are certainly more pragmatic when it comes to economic regulation, when it comes to certain things, in terms of what we call social justice. And the Russians have had their fair experience, as you said earlier, with a government that was for 70 years trying to basically control every single individual, his consumption, his education, the whole 9 yards. And to a degree, the Russians, although there's still some talk about, we want a strong Russia and a strong government and strong state, but what they do understand what is a strong state, by our Western, customs would probably be, almost minarchism. But that doesn't mean that they're entirely more rational. I mean, they have made certain experience and they have drawn certain lessons from it, but they do have their own fair share of identity politics and social justice on another scale. One good example would be the quite futile attempt to, somehow rekindle, for instance, the nuclear family and subsidizing it. There's a law for so-called mother capital. So a woman after the second child gets, first of all, federal money, although that money is bound to either be saved for the child's education or for buying a common home, apartment or house or something like that, or for the pension of the mother. Yeah, so they have their own share of traditionalism that we also do have. And they do also these things like trying to subsidize that. But of course, you don't have that kind of nonsense about having a month-long debate in Congress about, or in the media about, should there be, a third section of toilets for transgender people, or something.
How, you mentioned that they're trying to rekindle traditionalism. I mean, how effective is that? How effective has it been?
I mean, they have had very limited success, to be honest. The birth rates have been increasing from a very, dramatic low in the early 2000s, late 90s. But I think we can attribute that mostly to the general improvement in the economic situation and not so much to the policy. I mean, they still do have, as I said, the Orthodox Church is getting stronger, especially in the 2000s, as the Russians were looking for basically a new version of national identity. Because you have to understand that during the Soviet period, there was a kind of saying, they said, Georgia, the Georgian SSR is for the Georgians, the Armenian SSR is for the Armenians, and so on and so forth, and the Russian Soviet Republic is for everybody. So basically, the Communist Party, to a degree, has tried to, quote-unquote, eradicate any sort of Russian nationalism or Russian national identity, but at the same time tolerating the identity of basically most other nations in order to basically buy their loyalty to the Soviet state. And that has triggered, let's say, a phase of confusion which the Russians are trying to, sometimes, literally looking into the books of history and saying, okay, who are we, what are our values, and trying to go back in time. But as I said, it's not going to work, and it doesn't work. I mean, the divorces remain high. I mean, they have illegitimacy has been dropping in Russia. But if you look how much money is actually invested there, if you do, does it work? Well, it works limited, but you need disproportionately a lot of money to have minor improvements.
Well, as you pointed out, Russia, like every other modern country, has been undergoing these industrialization changes, all these things that happened, I suppose, much earlier in the United States and in Germany. I mean, you need to take a bird's eye view. You need to look at things in sort of the overwhelming superstructure, and you can't change an institution like marriage if you're living in a high-tech modern society with Tinder and, at least in Germany, what is it, poppen.de, and I mean, that, not that that's necessarily a legitimate site, but the point is that there are all these options out there, and you're not going to be able to fix something with legislation when it really goes down back to the fundamentals of how the society looks in terms of its infrastructure and technology and things like that. I suppose it's a nice thought for traditionalists, but once again, if you're looking for that faithful Eastern European wife, forget about it.
No, indeed. I mean, as we know, the marriages fail at the same rate as they do in the West. And while they might have reduced legitimacy, that means children being born out of wedlock, that doesn't mean that these children grow up with both parents. And they have the same biased courts, although they have no, notable feminism like, let's say, in America or Canada or Sweden. But they have the same biased
courts. They don't get the same payouts either. I mean, the from what I understand, not the same degree. Divorce, what I've studied, is mostly motivated by women's unhappiness. People think it's about a payout, like, they're going to get lots of money, but you go to a place like Ukraine or Russia or Moldova, the women aren't getting tons of money by leaving these marriages. They're not, they don't, to my knowledge, there's no court order forcing the man to pay for the next 20 years.
Oh, there is.
Okay.
There is, but I mean, the difference is always, how much can it be enforced? And what you will see in Russia is that, especially with Russian men, and as I'm saying, this is still a society that is trying to find its own identity, is they have a very confused version, like one part of the brain is in the future and in the present, and one part is in an idealized traditionalist past. You very often have men who voluntarily assume this role. To have a situation like, say, in some parts of Germany or France or Holland, where you see young single dads or even married fathers pushing the pram, taking a day off from work, you will rather not see this in Moscow or St. Petersburg.
Yeah. Well, yeah, but I think it's just a matter of time. I would think that we can observe these sort of macro tendencies of human beings across multiple societies, that when you have this technology, what I've called the mechanization effect, when you have, relatively speaking, mass comfort. I mean, even in Russia, it's pretty cheap to get internet, from what I understand. I know when I was visiting, Ukraine, it wasn't a big deal there either. So you have all these things. It's just an inevitability that maybe they're still battling with the ghosts of the past, but they're going to be moving in the same direction eventually. Maybe not. Maybe you won't get all this sort of gay pride thing stuff and what have you, but I think it's just a matter of time, because there's certainly human universals.
Indeed.
In every country I've observed, particularly a place like I'm pretty familiar with, like South Korea, where internet, divorce is sky high, traditional society. In fact, you can't really get too much more traditional than a Confucianist society, but hey, they're just throwing it away too. I don't really see this as a long-term thing. I think they're just battling with the ghosts of the past, like a lot of these traditional societies. It's just that in places like the United States and Germany and the United Kingdom, they were just, I guess, quicker to get rid of all of these ghosts or whatever you want to call them, and just move on. I'm not saying it's necessarily a good thing, but there certainly was no Iron Curtain legacy in a place like the United Kingdom or what have you. So,
I mean, there's what you say, the Iron Curtain legacy is, and you still find that to some degree, the mentality of Russian, tendency to self-isolate. And that's not just the government. Actually, I would say the government, current government, for all its wrongdoings and everything, is probably way more progressive than most of its own population in terms of historical progression. Russia is a country that is, very divided in itself. There's not just one Russia, there are several Russias. What do I mean by this is, you go to Moscow and St. Petersburg, and these are, especially Moscow, it's a global metropolis. You have these, similar pictures, you have all sorts of migrants and international companies and skyscrapers. I think what you yourself once referred to as the global monoculture. All the cities suddenly look the same. You get the same sushi in Moscow as you get it in Seoul or in London. It's literally, their differences are melting away as these places enter and are more firmly, connected to the global capitalist system.
Yeah.
But then you have other places, like look at those like former industrial cities in the province, in the Russian province. They are, let's say, 20 years behind. So you travel by car a few hours. And you also do a good deal of time traveling. You go to some places that they have maybe electricity and they use still fixed line phones because there's no cell phone reception. They still watch TV. I mean, I haven't watched TV in ages because of the internet. Why would you do that? They still watch TV. They drive cars from the Soviet period. Like some places, like you have the feeling things never really changed.
Maybe like Yakutia or something like that.
Oh no, you don't even need to go that far. It's just a few hours driving to some village outside of the Moscow Oblast, even.
Yeah.
So it's not that you need to go that far. Or, it goes even worse when you go to the more provincial places around, let's say Penza or Samara or these places. And then of course you have other places which are completely out of touch, like for instance the North Caucasus, which is in some places predominantly Muslim, especially Dagestan and Chechnya. But you are in an Oriental country now. It's still the Russian Federation, there's still the Russian flag, but you hear the muezzin calling for prayer. You see basically no other religion present. Many women wear the veil, that sort of stuff. And you feel like, well, this could be Syria, this could be Lebanon, this could be, anything. This could be an independent Islamic country.
Yeah. Well, I mean that's the thing, that it's just a question, as I mentioned, of catching up. Whereas a place like Moscow, it's basically already caught up, minus a lot of the politically correct nonsense. Now, moving on from that, we talked about the politics. I mean, there's one figure who is always standing at the middle of this, and that's Vladimir Putin, or however you pronounce it correctly. This guy, really colorful guy. Grew up during the Soviet Union era, member of the KGB, was very much enmeshed in Eastern Germany, and to this day still speaks German quite well. It's impossible to get an accurate picture of him. I think you really see it's kind of this either or. It's this sort of devil or demon or, I don't know, hero or what have you. It's this, and human beings, I've talked about this. This is a tendency they have, it's referred to as Macchiainian. It's either this really, really evil or really, really good. Obviously, he's a politician who grew into his politics during unique circumstances. What would be an accurate picture of Putin? I mean, the West, they call him a thug, a tyrant, criminal, all these things. Maybe that's true. And I know that in the ranks of Russian nationalists, he's considered a hero, the glue that holds the country together, right?
Oh no, on the contrary, no. The Russian right indeed villainizes Putin,
okay.
And they villainize him for the very same reason. Let's say the AfD is villainizing Merkel. He's letting in migrants. He doesn't do much for his own Russian race. That kind of stuff. It's the same. It's essentially the Putin is very interesting because actually it's not even something new in history. Russia has always been the projection, a kind of projection space for Western ideas of either progress or regression. So we either idealize Russia very often or we demonize Russia. I mean, the left-wing intellectuals have, for instance, even tried to somehow justify or talk down on, let's say, Stalinism, like, oh, it wasn't that bad, and, people weren't really hungry, and it actually worked out, and it was not that bad, and people supported, that kind of stuff, social justice. And then the others who said, no, it's the empire of evil. And that is something that takes place actually even before communism. The German social democratic politician August Bebel in the 19th century, when he was already an old man, the founding father of the German, workers' movement and social democratic party, he basically said in his old age, if we declare war on Russia, I will, despite my age, volunteer to fight it, because at that time Russia was still, a czarist autocracy. They didn't have any kind of public schools or pension or anything. You still had the aristocracy, which owned most of the land. And Russia was then seen as this backward, evil, monster from the absolutist monarchist period that might, try to hold back Europe or even take it over. Then you had the revolution, and then again you had the same thing. We had people, basically, praising everything the communists did, and then you had people who were basically condemning everything the communists did. So Russia, it's not new that Russia is being idealized, and the people leading Russia with it. Yeah, so and Vladimir Putin is no exception. I mean, Vladimir Putin, I would even say, is more a driven person than he is in the driver's seat, because most decisions he had to make were painful decisions, and he didn't really have a lot of choice. I mean, when there was the war in Chechnya still going on, when he just came to power in the late 90s, I think probably every Russian politician would have said, if we don't end this and win this, then we really run into a situation where we will have Russia becoming unraveled. You will have Tatarstan, Bashkortostan, and God knows whatever kind of province that is not majority Russian, trying to declare some sort of independence or, not obeying federal law or something like that. Yeah, so I guess that the idea to go to war here, I think if Putin would have died in a car accident in the early 90s, being a cab driver, which he was for some time actually, when he left the KGB, and there would be some other person coming to power at that period, he would be faced with the same choice. And what kind of choice do? You try to save the country, even if it's, a violent solution, or you just sit by idly. The whole North Caucasus explodes in more violence. And the few Christian minorities and Russian minorities living there will face probably, persecution, almost extinction. Or you do something about it. That means sending in the army and not looking too much at civilian casualties. It was a tough choice. The same choice was when he was liberalizing the economy with his still praised tax reform, introducing a very low flat tax of back then 13%. He had to do it. The country was bankrupt, the economy was stagnant and shrinking, and they knew the only thing to do, and the tax system didn't even work. They had nominally high taxes, but nobody was paying them. And the few people that paid them were those of the very low incomes, because their money was taken away from the income automatically. But the entrepreneurs, and especially the oligarchs, didn't bother with that. They just hid their money, and the Russian tax administration didn't have a chance to go after them.
Speaking of the oligarchs, maybe you can talk a little bit more about that. I mean, we've heard in the West that Putin, he purged the oligarchs, as it were. They all disappeared or what have you. What's the real deal with that? What actually happened?
He didn't purge the oligarchs. I mean, he purged some of them who basically openly defied the law and who basically thought they can go on like in the 1990s under Yeltsin. I mean, there is the very famous case of Khodorkovsky, and I know this for many listeners might be a very controversial issue. I'm not trying to demonize Khodorkovsky either, but if you ask me what was his problem, well, Khodorkovsky didn't understand that times have changed, that this is not Yeltsin and this is not anymore the roaring 90s, where basically if you have money you can buy anything you want, including courts and even the government. Yeah, and instead of accepting this and still keeping his wealth and his company, he basically went on an all-out war with the Kremlin. He refused to comply with certain laws and regulations. There's a huge... it's very... You can see it very critical, because he was actually imprisoned for tax evasion. We can now have a big discussion, whether that tax evasion did take place in that way or not. They basically, what they did is they, undervalued a company. So the tax base would be much lower. And basically by this cheating the Russian government out of lots of taxes. That's what he went to jail for. Did others do the same thing? Hell yeah. They probably did even worse. But he was the one who was openly defying and saying, no, basically I don't accept the times have changed. I still want to buy my government as I did under the Yeltsin era. And that basically put him at loggerheads with Putin, and then they just, pulled the trigger on him, essentially. But the oligarchs are not gone. The oligarchs are not gone. They're still there, but they are less so involved in politics.
I find it's always an interesting question. I mean, when people assign blame to someone like Putin, say for what happened in Chechnya as an example, or really anything else, what would other people have done? I mean, as you point out, these are really difficult situations. I mean, even when I think about, and I don't want to get too off topic, this sort of, and this is going to sound strange, but universal condemnation of Nazism during the Third Reich.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not saying what they did is good by any means. It was horrific. But, the question of what you would have done had you been in the same boots as these people, or what any individual might have done had they been in the office and position of Putin during some of these difficult trials. And I think, it's just really easy to cast and assign blame and to say, well, he fucked up. But, I mean, how many of us would have done a better job or even a different job? I mean, I'm just going to make this example up. Let's say, for whatever reason, North Dakota goes rogue. Everyone, in the state, they get their guns and say, we want to free North Dakota. And technically it's within legal constitutional rights to secede from the Union. And, they get all their guns and they say, Washington no longer holds jurisdiction over blah, blah, blah. And what would the United States do? Well, they would probably send in federal agents at the very least. I mean, there would be violence, and whoever tried to stamp that out would, be called all sorts of things.
And it's very funny you mentioned that, because there's historical precedents where some states actually tried to secede from the United States government, and what happened was exactly the same thing. They sent in the federal army to crush it.
Yeah, I mean, with this American Civil War, one of the bloodiest conflicts in modern history, and I don't think any of us, if we had been in the driver's seat of any of these, or basically in charge of dealing with these conflicts, could have necessarily done a better job. I mean, I'm not saying that what Putin did was good, or what Lincoln did was good, or whatever. If North Dakota does secede, people, but I mean, what are you going to do? If you have a position of influence and power, history is just going to look at you in a funny way, and you're always going to be judged. And it's easy for the nobodies like us to say, well, he completely fucked up.
And then you have to understand the sheer diversity of Russia, not just in terms of ethnicities and religion, but also in terms of, as I said, you have people who live in the 21st century, and then you go out a few miles, essentially, and you have people who live in the 20th century, or even, way in the early 20th century to some degree. And how would you believe that in such a country you would have the enlightened politics, let's say, of, for the lack of a better term, of Norway or Sweden or Denmark implemented on such a country with such a population, where you have those people in the big cities that are living basically not much different from what you and I and most of our listeners live. And then you have the people who still hold on, whether it makes sense or not, to old, traditions and old values and mores, no matter how horrible or good that is. It is clear from that situation that they just couldn't go full, let's say, progressive and say, well, we will now be the landmark of democracy, human rights, LGBT, and whatever. If majority of the population, especially those living in the countryside, basically still think homosexuality is a sort of disorder that needs to be, tackled.
Yeah, yeah, and I think this is why when we're looking at places like Russia and just other countries that don't have our specific traditions or same history, I think we just need to be cautious with the kinds of prejudices we bring to the table, as well as judgments. Now, I personally don't give a shit about homosexuality either way. I don't think we need to crusade for it, but it is what it is, and people do grow up under different traditions. And this is an area where I would agree with what Putin has said publicly. I mean, and some other people. Americans might do it a certain way, and Russians, at least for the time being, might do it their way. I don't really have an issue with that because they're Russian, and Americans are American, and then Danish people are Danish. And I mean, it's just, to some degree, there's going to be differentiation, and there's already a kind of, as I mentioned, monoculture that's been going on and really has infiltrated every major city, but there will be some residual differences, and I think it falls to us to just accept them as not that big a deal, I think at least, rather than casting moral condemnation upon entire nation and Putin. I mean, I don't think he's in a difficult position.
I mean, don't get me wrong. I seriously think that homophobia is a special form of misandry because it's mostly directed against males.
Yeah.
You barely hear people, saying, "Oh, those two lesbians." That's disgusting. You usually,
well, lesbians tend to be pretty unattractive. But,
the same people would, rather, watch some porn tube of lesbian sex. But you very hear this.
Who aren't actual lesbians, usually, but yeah.
Yeah, but that's a different story.
Yeah.
But what I want to say is that again, this issue about homosexuality in Russia has been blown out of proportion. I mean, yes, there are gangs, especially in rural Russia, where if they would find a couple holding hands, two men, they would probably insult them or even assault them, and even seriously assault them. There have been a number of cases where some people got killed or hospitalized or whatever. These cases do exist, especially in those places. At the same time, St. Petersburg and Moscow are basically the refuge for many LGBT people who come from, let's say, the Caucasus or even from other now independent republics such as Armenia, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, the whole lot of it, who say it's the only place in the post-Soviet, region where I can feel safe. You have gay clubs in the large cities. There was even I forgot the name. There was even a street, basically, almost a whole, like a small suburb, like the Christopher Street in New York, maybe, or something like this. We had one gay club and one gay bar after another, So that still exists. The law that everybody has been so pissed about, and its effect actually has been completely, like this domestic violence thing, completely blown out of proportion. I mean, first of all, the law is very vague. But the law doesn't cite specifically homosexuality. The law says towards minors, you should not conduct anti-traditional propaganda and degrading traditional relationships between men and women. Now, if you factor in that almost 15 to 20% of Russian citizens are Muslims, and you know what their stance on marriage and homosexuality is, they certainly welcome those laws. But does it mean that you cannot be gay in Russia? Hell no, it doesn't mean that. It means even that, as I said, many people actively flee other countries in the post-Soviet space if they are gay to go to Russia, at least to the big cities, because they are safe there. Well, you can be more or less openly homosexual in Moscow, but you can do that in Yerevan or in Baku or in those other places.
Yeah, and I think this just goes back to I just keep on bringing this up, but I mean, people have different standards, and if you want to play the role of the crusader and change the world everywhere, I mean, you can try, but changes, I think, take place pretty organically. And we've already seen the change in the disruption and destruction of the so-called traditional family and marriage organically, for the most part.
Yes.
It wasn't, nobody sat, well, I think the alt-right thinks certain people sat around and plotted it, but
yes, it was the Jews preferably. They had a secret meeting in Tel Aviv, and they said we have to do something about marriage. Well, I think what happened in reality is that just people sat down with themselves and did something about marriage by either not getting married anymore or by divorcing way more often. That's the thing. The only question is, how do you organize this social trend? Do you try to put brackets on it, as we do it in not just in Russia but also in the West, by threatening people? Well, you will lose custody if you get divorced. You will lose money if you get divorced. You will lose your tax privileges if you get divorced. Or do we just let things happen and let society decide for itself? And in that respect, what we claim so much about Russia is the same thing that we do.
Well, yeah, and I think effectively,
we are not that different. That's my point. There has been an article about equality of gender, now less with respect to Russia, but you can apply the reasoning to Russia, by Bassam Tibi, who is, I don't know if you surely have heard about him, a scholar, one of the top scholars on Arabic Islamic culture. And the issue was about the refugees, and there was the Syrian Muslim refugees coming to Germany, and they need to be taught by the government that men and women are equal, and so on and so forth. And he said something very interesting. He said, we demand the sort of enlightenment from these people that to a standard that we ourselves don't live up to it. And I think you and I would probably agree when it comes to equality that there's still a lot of things to do. Of course, you and I would probably focus more on the male issues, but you and I would probably agree, as would most of our listeners, that we don't have that full equality they're talking about between men and women.
Well, quite the opposite, I think.
Quite the opposite. And yet those people are saying, oh, but these people don't have or don't believe in full equality. Well, what we are doing. We are just projecting.
But I mean, I think you and I both know that equality is just code for giving women free shit and giving women free passage to do whatever they want.
Yeah, but then that's preferential treatment. That's not equality.
But that's not. Yes, but that's the point, right? That in the West, equality just means preferential treatment. It doesn't mean equality. It hasn't for decades, and especially in the last 20 years. I mean, it's a bit off topic, but you hear these stories about the rape scare on American campuses. And I went to university in the mid and late 90s, and you had some weird groups, but people were, this didn't exist, and it's real because not that the rapes are real, but the perception and the claims that are being made, they're real. I looked up my alma mater months back. They have a 9-page citation there about how to conduct yourself. All these stories from other universities. So what I'm getting at here is that it's gotten even worse, and equality always in I'd say the last 50 or 60 years has meant preferential treatment.
Yes, identity politics.
It's just identity politics, and the shame of it all is that too many men buy into it. I was listening to a former Iraqi refugee, educated one, talk to a guy named Dave Rubin who has this show, talks politics, whatever, and he just went on talking about misogyny and things like that. And it's hard to take these claims too seriously, but this is with this Polish woman I saw in an article, supposedly demonstrating for Russian women. It's it's a bunch of bullshit. But I don't think we can penetrate that mask. Some people, the YouTube community, we know it's a bunch of bullshit. We also, and they're not even just MGTOW. Even the alt-right, for all their flaws, recognizes that women's liberation, at least for their own devices and purposes, has been a disaster. But liberation from what? Getting more free shit? Okay.
Yeah, indeed, having a preferential lifestyle, and to that degree, that kind of double standard, they do exist in Russia. Only in Russia, maybe they don't put this kind of veil on it, pretending it is this, but we call it something else. They call a spade a spade. They say, well, we want to foster traditionalism by essentially doing the same thing the Western countries do, by basically giving taxpayer money to married couples and to mothers. It's the same thing we do in the West, but they just call it traditional policy. We do it and we call it equality, or find some other kind of excuse for doing the same thing. When the Russians do it and call the spade a spade, everybody is rising up and saying, oh, horrible, backward, but we are doing the same thing. So that's what I mean. For the most part, Russia has been this projection space where everybody projects a lot of the wrongdoings and illnesses that they themselves face in their own countries.
Well, they're being intellectually dishonest with themselves.
Indeed.
In the West, and they're blame. Well, I mean, yeah. If anything, I guess the Russians are being just sort of more upfront and honest. It's like, I guess so I mean, the difference between having a relationship and visiting a prostitute. Well, most relationships with women are just long-term prostitution. You're going to spend money, you're going to have a higher phone bill, but all this shit. It's effectively prostitution, so you can get sex. That's the main reason. But nobody who wants to maintain a public personality or presence could say that. But I mean, prostitutes just like, give me the money and we'll fuck. And I think that maybe not a perfect analogy, but it's not too dissimilar. That there's so much pretense in the West, and that's why for all the problems I found in Ukraine and that kind of honesty you could even see in their faces to some degree.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, it's corrupt, but they're not going through all this bullshit, which was nice,
I mean, a good thing is, for instance, migration. Now you have a lot of people who say, "Oh, migration is difficult," and so on and so forth, and they will just pussyfoot around what really worries them. They will pussyfoot around the fact that they are afraid that they are going to have to pay more taxes, or that the taxes that they pay will not go into services benefiting themselves, but benefiting the migrants, in order to train them and teach them the language and integrate them and whatnot. They will basically pussyfoot around the topic instead of, as I said, calling a spade a spade. And maybe the nations of the post-Soviet bloc, they have learned that kind of luxury, being in denial and having this political correctness, because the USSR had lots of political correctness. There were lots of very obvious things that went wrong, and you were not allowed to say it, most notably in the economy. If you said the central planning doesn't work, it was the end of your professional career, it was the end of your political career for some time at least, and you would face not just ostracizing from the government, but even from the other people. So every society has its taboos, and to some degree, and I'm saying this very carefully, at least in some respect, those nations who have had their share of, taboo and state taboo and political correctness, they know that always comes with a very heavy price at some point in history.
Yeah, and I think I don't want to redirect it to Hungary, but people are often, in the West, they're horrified that you have a party in Hungary like Jobbik. You've heard of Jobbik, right?
Yeah, I heard of it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean they're pretty extreme, but so what? Hungary was a satellite of the Soviet Union for a really long time. It makes sense that people would tolerate. Well, when you're in a system where there's basically a one-party system, it makes sense that you're going to allow a whole bunch of parties and different views to the very least exist. Whatever that party might, whatever percentage of the population that party might represent. But this is something that I think people don't get in the West, and it's an excellent point you're making. Like they say, how can you support Jobbik? They say all these horrible things about all sorts of people, and 20% of the Hungarian population supports them. Well,
Yeah, but let's do an experiment. Let's go to some posh area in a major German city. Let's say whether it's, I think, Grunwald in Munich or Blankenese in Hamburg, where all the millionaires have their nice villas. And you're going to tell them, gentlemen, most of these people are essentially establishment and they're, refugees welcome and so on and so forth. Now you're going to tell them, we're building here social housing projects close to your villas, and we will allocate the refugees here at your doorstep. And you will see immediately that, no, this doesn't work. This will have a negative impact on the value of my property. This might, my daughters can go outside. They might be raped or this or that. Or, they will come up with the same sentiment.
Yeah.
They are only supportive because it doesn't affect them, because maybe on some level they think they might benefit from it. Well, I can replace my Polish cleaning woman now with a Syrian cleaning woman, and she maybe works for half the money. But living with these people and, paying a price for that, no, please. Yeah. And that's very typical for any society. Germany, Russia, America, everybody wants to do these great crusades, as you call them, but nobody really wants to pay a price. Everybody says we must change, there must be reforms, but once you do something, everybody says, but don't start with me, start over there, start with other people. Yeah. And it's this hypocrisy that we have cultivated in the West, and that's how we see Russia, that we criticize the very essential things that we too do wrong. I mean, rekindling the issue of homosexuality. I mean, how many countries in the West have full equality of homosexual and heterosexual people? Not just with marriage, but let's say in issues of adoption, surrogacy, reproductive rights, etc., etc. Very, very few.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we criticize the inequality there. Not saying we shouldn't, but you might use this biblical quote. You're criticizing the splinter in the eye of the other person, but you yourself, you have a massive
log. Yeah, it's the Jesus quote. Do not look to the splinter in his eye, but look to the log in your own. Yeah,
exactly. And it a bit comes down. Is
that Luke? Oh, fuck, I forgot. Anyway, sorry. I'm trying to remember.
Well, I'm not a Bible expert,
okay. No
but essentially that is how Russia is seen. I mean, what is Russia today? Russia is a country, yes, that has lots of problems with its borders. They have lots of problems because many ethnic Russians still do live outside the current borders of Russia, and that created, as we have tackled already, for instance, also a civil war in Ukraine. There is a latent conflict in Kazakhstan, way more downplayed because the Kazakh government has been way more clever in managing its own ethnic diversity. And basically the Kazakhs have no other way to go. I mean, the Ukrainians have a border with Poland, but the Kazakhs either go with Russia or with who else would they go? The border with China, or with other Central Asian republics. If they want to do trade and business, Russia is the preferred partner who is just at their doorstep. Yeah, so they have been more clever about this, maybe because they lacked any kind of option. Maybe if the Kazakhs would have a border with Turkey, they would have been more pronounced Turkish nationalist and Islamists than they present themselves right now. Yeah, so it very often also comes down to the circumstances. And in that way, Russia, what Russia is today really is nothing else but a globally seen a middle-income country. It's roughly, let's say, the same income as Mexico, something like that. So it's a middle-income country. It's industrializing. It has lots of problems and lots of tensions within its borders and with some of its neighbors. But that Russia is this very special case. There's what was it called? A mystery wrapped in an enigma and so on and so forth. No, it isn't.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's an excellent way of as we move towards the end of getting to the heart of the matter. Civilizations and countries are understandable. We tend to shroud them in mystery, or we demonize them in the case of Russia. I mean, I don't know the truth of the claims or allegations that Russia had directly involved itself in the recent American presidential election.
Yeah, it's ridiculous, I would say.
Yeah, but
I mean, Everybody knew that people were fed up with Barack Obama's identity politics. He didn't deliver on the economy. I mean, labor participation rates are at an all-time low.
No,
Debt has been going
Obama's
up.
legacy, I mean, his main legacy for most liberal people is that he was the first black president. I mean, that's a
Good.
pretty lame legacy to have.
I mean, he isn't even black. His mother is white.
Well, half
He was
black.
raised. He was raised by that mother. So, what connection did he have with the?
Right, well,
African-
sorry, his melanin content, his skin,
Yeah.
he's darker than most. I mean,
Yeah.
that's like saying, the first bald. I mean, it's just so unremarkable, and it's not an accomplishment. It's so unremarkable a feature. And his legacy, which liberal people tend to overlook, and I don't want to talk too much about Obama, is drone strikes.
Yeah.
A really kind of unstable, not particularly well thought out and executed foreign policy.
Yeah.
I'm not going to, no, he wasn't the worst president ever, but he wasn't a great president. And I'm not going to say because he was black or, sorry, had dark skin that, this was a great monumental accomplishment. But we all know what would happen in the future if a female got elected. And be like, this is amazing, she has a vagina. I mean, that's effectively what would happen. And I think we have this tendency to do that. I'm going to be making a separate video on some of the recent stuff involving Trump, but I mean, I think we all need to sort of get real. Presidents are just presidents, they're not, very few are amazing. And the good ones are the ones you pretty much forget about, like Grover Cleveland. Not many people know about him. Probably, you not being American, probably don't even, anyway. More on Grover Cleveland at a later date. But I think covered most of the basics, and unfortunately I have work to do, gleich. So, any final thoughts you'd like to add, that things that we might have missed? I think we've really demonstrated that a culture or civilization grows up in a different system, it's going to have a different approach, and that people are put into difficult positions. I'm not saying Putin is a saint. I'm not saying he's a hero. He's a guy with a job that has to deal with a lot of shit, and he does what he does, basically.
I mean, by the standards, the country that he inherited to manage, as you say, to wrap this up, he had a devastated economy. Most of the Russian economy was under no circumstances competitive with Western companies. So there was only oil and gas, and that's basically the big slice where the Russian government also gets its income from, and where most Russian people, where their job security hangs on by this very slender thread of the oil and gas prices. And by these standards, you might say, well, he has done a decent job. The thing is that Russia, for whatever it is not that, barbaric, so different, so dangerous country. It's not. It's a country that has lots of problems. Most of its economy still is not competitive with the West. It will take some time. There is some silver lining. The Russians have a very good education standard. They have a very lively startup culture in Moscow and St. Petersburg, where you have lots of young technology companies. Instead of, looking back into the past, looking into the future, you have a young, educated, new generation of Russians who will likely adapt, less identity politics, at least conservative identity politics, as they have done maybe, let's say, in the previous years. And for all intents and purposes, it's not that danger to Europe as we are very often told to believe. But then it's not, for the same reason, it's also not that paradise for man or for tradition or for family. It's a country that has the same afflictions, that goes through the same process. And I think the best way to look at Russia is to basically like you look at your own country. Because it's a European country, it's a European culture, it's not that different from Germany, from Poland, from France, for the most part. They have the same issues. We have problems in France or Britain or Germany with Muslim migration. They have the same issue with their migrants. They only come from different places. They don't come from Morocco or Algeria or Bangladesh, but they come from the Caucasus republics, from Azerbaijan or from Tajikistan or Uzbekistan. For all intents and purposes, it is a similar country with very similar problems by and large, and they are just more open about their politics, for the better or for worse.
Yeah, yeah. Well said. Well said. Everyone, thanks for tuning in on this Saturday. Alexander and I both have stuff to do, unfortunately. I have work, and he has a busy and fabulous social life that I lack. But that, I think, was very enlightening to get an honest, I legitimately think, a more honest appraisal and perception of Russia. You know, people are people, countries are countries. They have their history, and we need to try to remain somewhat objective in our analyses, at the same time not being blinded to our own insanity and our own hypocrisy. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good way to wrap it up. And if anything, we can credit the Russians that they have tried to do everything in the late 80s, especially, to basically get us all out of the Cold War.
Yeah.
The decision for the German reunification to be possible was ultimately made in Moscow. If Gorbachev back then had said we are not giving up East Germany, then either there would have been probably a war or a civil war or some other sort of conflict, or there would be some sort of semi-independent East Germany now. There would not be a Germany reunification. There would have been violence across Eastern Europe. So we can give the Russians credit for basically ending the madness of the Cold War. And we also have to give them some credit as they are now trying to fix a problem in the Middle East, with, let's say, regards to combating jihadi factions in Syria.
Which also good topic we should cover at some point in time.
Another good topic, so we can give them credit for that. Well, there are lots of other things we shouldn't give them credit for, but when we look what these things are, it's inequality between the sexes, lower life expectancy for men, etc. We do have the same things, maybe not to the similar extremes in some cases, but very often we are not that far from the things we criticize over there. And I think that we should always keep in mind when we talk about Russia, probably not for the last time.
If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.